This podcast is for Chapter 20 on communities. There are two sections, one on interactions and the other one is on patterns. One of the interactions that we're going to talk about is predation. Predation is an interaction in which one organism, the predator, captures and eats all or part of the other individual organism, which is the prey. The fox eats the rabbit. Predators have adaptations to efficiently capture prey. They need to be fast, for example, whereas prey species also have adaptations to avoid being captured by the predators. Plants have adaptations too. Many plants produce secondary compounds. A lot of them are chemicals, for example. As a chemical defense, for example, this is poison ivy. Between species, another interaction is competition, where two species are competing for the same resource. Sometimes competition can be so bad that it can cause competitive exclusion, which is when one of the species in the community is completely wiped out and eliminated. Also, character displacement can occur. Over time, competition may drive the evolution or the change of niche differences among competitors. This evolution of differences in a characteristic due to competition is called character displacement, and I have an example for you. In birds, warblers for example, there are, let's say, 5 different species and they all feed on the same insect that are in the same tree. So over time, and due to competition, they all adapted to this, and so you can see that the myrtle warbler in purple only feed on the bottom of the tree now. The bay-breasted warbler feeds in the middle. The black-throated feeds in the middle top, and the Blackburnian warbler and the Cape May warbler feed at the very, very top of the trees. So this is character displacement where they have changed where they feed due to competition, and that allows them all to survive. All right, another set of relationships that we're going to talk about is called symbiosis. Symbiosis is the big category under all of these 3 types fall under. Symbiosis is a relationship in which 2 organisms live in close association to one another, and there are 3 types: parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism. The first one is parasitism. In parasitism, one species feeds on another species. The parasite is going to feed on its host, and we usually will not kill the host because it needs the host for food. For example, a tick. Another one is commensalism. In commensalism, one species is going to benefit and the other one is not going to be infected. An example of this is mites. Those little red mites are getting transportation from the damselfly, and the damselfly is not being affected by this. The third one is mutualism. In mutualism, both interacting species are going to benefit. An example of this are the birds on the rhino. The birds are eating the ticks off of the rhino, and so the rhino is getting clean, and the ticks are getting food. All right, another concept is species richness and species evenness. Make sure you understand the difference between these 2 terms. Species richness is the actual number of species that are in a community. So the actual number of how many different species there are in the community. Species interactions like predation can increase species richness. Species richness is the greatest at the equator. Species evenness is the abundance of each species, like how even are the different numbers of species in that community. That is called species evenness. All right, another concept that is in this chapter is on succession. Ecological succession, or they just call it succession, is a change in the species composition of a community over time. And there are 2 types, primary and secondary. In primary succession, that is when things are changing for the very first time. It is the assembly of a community on newly formed land, newly created habitat. Primary succession occurs in areas that have been recently exposed to the elements and lack soil. So it'll start off with soil, eventually some very, very small grass and shrubs, and eventually trees and forests. So it's starting from brand new land. Secondary succession is the change of the existing community following something that happened, some type of disturbance. Secondary succession occurs in areas where the original ecosystem has been cleared by a disturbance, like a hurricane, a forest fire, a volcano erupted and the lava, killed the land, and it's rebuilding itself from existence. That is called secondary succession. The traditional description of succession is that the community will proceed through all these different series of changes until it reaches a stable endpoint called the climax community. Where we live is called the climax community. Our community will not change anymore. Primary succession typically proceeds from lichens and mosses all the way to a climax community. Secondary succession typically starts from weeds, and then we'll get there eventually over time to a climax community. Here's a picture of, for example, of a succession at Glacier Bay. So you can see on the left, there is barely any life there. The glacier is basically lifeless. It lacked some nutrients, and then eventually we got a pioneer of the land. The first species was Dryas, a rock rose. You can see that on the left. And then after several decades, you can see in the middle picture that we finally are getting some shrubs. And then eventually we got our trees and shrubs on the right, like spruces and hemlocks, for example. So that is called succession. And that completes chapter 20.